Emily Dawson stood on the busy city sidewalk. The noise of the cars, buses, and people filled the air. It was just another normal day for most. But for Emily, every day came with challenges. She tapped her white cane softly against the pavement, feeling the world through sound and touch. By her side stood Max, her loyal guide dog. Max was a beautiful German shepherd, his coat shiny and smooth. His ears perked up, and his eyes scanned the bustling street. He was always alert, always watching. Max's leash was tight in Emily's hand, and though she couldn't see, she trusted Max completely. He was her partner, her protector, and her eyes in a world of shadows. To anyone passing by, Emily seemed like just another blind woman. People barely noticed her, rushing past as they hurried to work or chatted on their phones. She was quiet and unassuming, blending into the background of the busy city life. Some people might have even thought she was weak or helpless. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Emily wasn't just anyone. Beneath her calm appearance was a woman who had faced more than most people could imagine. Her life wasn't ordinary. She had lived through moments of fear, bravery, and danger. And Max wasn't just any guide dog. He was trained for something far greater, something that made him special. Today, his unique skills were going to be needed in a way no one could have predicted. Emily adjusted her sunglasses and tilted her head slightly, listening closely to the sounds around her. She could hear the hum of engines, the chatter of people, and the faint music playing from a nearby store. She had learned to navigate the world by paying attention to these details. With Max by her side, she felt confident. Still, there were moments when the world wasn't kind to her. People underestimated her because she couldn't see, and that often led to problems. As Emily stood there, waiting for the crosswalk light to change, she took a deep breath. The air smelled like fresh coffee from a cafe nearby, mixed with the faint scent of exhaust fumes. Max stayed perfectly still, his body tense but calm. He was always ready to move, always ready to protect. Little did Emily know, this day would be far from normal. She thought it was just another day of running errands, walking the familiar streets she had traveled so many times before. But something unexpected was about to happen, something that would remind everyone around her not to judge a book by its cover. Max's leash gave a slight tug as he shifted his position. Emily felt the movement immediately and knew he had sensed something. She trusted him completely. Max was not only her guide but also her guardian. His instincts were sharp, and he was trained to notice things most people would miss. Emily whispered softly, "What is it, Max?" She ran her fingers along his fur, feeling the strength and energy beneath his calm exterior. Max didn't respond with a bark or a growl, but Emily could tell he was alert. Something in the air had changed, and Max had noticed it before she did. Around her, the city buzzed with life. People walked by without a second glance, some texting on their phones, others chatting with friends. No one paid attention to the blind woman standing on the corner with her dog. They had no idea who she really was or what Max was capable of. Emily liked it that way. It allowed her to move through life without drawing too much attention. But today, that would change. Emily tightened her grip on Max's leash, her other hand holding her cane. She took a step forward, her cane tapping lightly in front of her. The sound it made helped her understand where she was, how close she was to the curb, and when to stop. Max walked beside her, guiding her every step of the way. They were a team, moving as one. "Excuse me," a voice said suddenly. Emily paused, tilting her head toward the sound. It was a man's voice, casual but curious. "Do you need help crossing the street?" Emily smiled politely. "No, thank you. Max and I have got it," she said. Her voice was calm and kind, but firm enough to make it clear she was fine on her own. The man hesitated, then walked away. This kind of interaction wasn't unusual. People often assumed she needed help, and while she appreciated their kindness, she was more than capable of handling herself. Emily had learned to be independent, to rely on her own strength and on Max. She didn't need anyone's pity. Max gave a slight pull on the leash again, signaling that it was time to cross. Emily moved forward confidently, trusting Max to guide her. The crosswalk light had changed, and the sound of footsteps and wheels filled the air as people crossed the street. Max navigated smoothly, keeping Emily safe from the bustling crowd and the cars that waited impatiently at the light. As they reached the other side, Emily felt a sense of relief. Walking through the city always came with its risks, but Max made it easier. She paused for a moment, feeling the sun on her face. Max sat beside her, his body calm but his eyes still scanning the area. He was always watching, always ready. What Emily didn't realize was that someone was watching her too. A group of bikers had pulled up near the corner, their loud engines growling like beasts. They wore leather jackets covered in patches, their faces rough and intimidating. They laughed and joked loudly, drawing attention to themselves. One of them, the leader, noticed Emily standing there with Max. A cruel grin spread across his face. "Hey, check her out," he said to his buddies, nodding in Emily's direction. "Blind lady with a big, tough dog. Think she's as tough as her mud." The others laughed, their voices echoing. They didn't see Emily as a person. To them, she was just someone to mess with, someone who couldn't fight back. They had no idea who she really was or what Max could do. Emily stood still, unaware of their mocking stares. But Max's ears twitched. He had noticed the bikers, and his sharp instincts told him they might be trouble. Emily sensed Max's slight tension and reached down to pat his head. "It's okay, Max," she whispered. "We're fine." But they weren't fine. Not yet. The bikers were about to make a big mistake, and Max was ready to show them just how wrong they were. The air filled with the growl of motorcycle engines as a group of bikers pulled up near the diner on the corner. The sound was loud and rough, cutting through the busy city noise like a thunderstorm. People on the sidewalk turned their heads for a moment, glancing at the gang, but most quickly looked away. No one wanted to draw their attention. The bikers laughed as they parked their motorcycles, their voices echoing off the buildings. They were a rowdy bunch, dressed in leather jackets covered in patches and symbols. Each patch seemed to tell a stories of fights, chaos, and trouble. They walked like they owned the street, their boots clunking heavily on the pavement. At the front of the group was Jeff, their leader. He was taller than the rest, with a cocky grin that made it clear he thought he was in charge of everything. Jeff scanned the sidewalk, his sharp eyes landing on Emily, who stood quietly with her white cane and guide dog, Max. To him, she looked like an easy target, a blind woman, vulnerable and quiet, someone who wouldn't talk back or fight. A cruel grin spread across his face as he nudged one of his gang members and nodded toward Emily. "Hey, lady," Jeff called out, his voice loud and mocking. The bikers around him chuckled, already guessing where this was going. Jeff swaggered a little closer, enjoying the attention he was getting from his gang. "Need a hand? Or maybe a pair of eyes?" he jeered, the sneer on his face growing wider. The gang burst into laughter, their voices carrying over the sounds of the city. They slapped each other on the back, enjoying the cruel joke. It was the kind of laugh that made people around them uncomfortable, the kind that told you they loved causing trouble. Emily stood still at the curb, her head slightly tilted as if she was listening carefully to everything. She didn't flinch at Jeff's words. She had heard comments like this before. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to mock her, and it probably wouldn't be the last. She tightened her grip on Max's leash, her fingers brushing against his fur for comfort. She bent down slightly, her lips barely moving as she whispered to her dog, "Stay calm, Max." "Not yet." Her voice was soft, but steady. It wasn't fear that made her pause, it was patience. Emily knew how to pick her battles. She knew when to act and when to wait. And she knew that Max, her loyal partner, would follow her lead. Max stood close by her side, his body perfectly still except for the slight twitching of his ears. He had heard Jeff's voice too, and he didn't like the tone of it. His sharp eyes locked onto the group of bikers, watching every movement they made. Max wasn't an ordinary dog, and his instincts told him these men were trouble. His training had prepared him for situations like this. He knew how to protect Emily, but he also knew how to wait for her signal. Jeff wasn't done yet. He took another step closer, his boots scraping against the concrete. "What's the matter, sweetheart?" he taunted, his tone dripping with fake kindness. "Can't you hear me? Or are you too scared to talk?" More laughter erupted from the gang, their voices louder now as they fed off Jeff's energy. One of the bikers leaned against his motorcycle, smirking as he added, "Maybe the dog does all the talking for her." "Hey, Mutt, can you speak?" Emily's grip on Max's leash tightened again, but her face stayed calm. She wasn't going to let them see that their words bothered her. She had dealt with people like this before, people who thought they were stronger or better because they could see, because they weren't blind like her. But Emily knew something they didn't. She had Max, and Max was more than just a guide dog. Max's body tensed slightly. He could sense the rising tension in the air, the way the bikers' laughter carried a note of mockery and challenge. His instincts were on high alert, but he stayed still, waiting for Emily's command. His sharp gaze didn't leave the group for a second. He wasn't afraid of them. He was ready. Jeff took one more step forward, now just a few feet away from Emily. He tilted his head, pretending to study her. "What's the matter?" he asked again, his voice louder and more mocking. "Don't you need help? You look like you do." Emily finally turned her head slightly in his direction. Her expression was calm, but her voice carried a quiet strength as she said, "No, thank you. I don't need your help." Her words were simple, but they had an edge that made Jeff pause for a split second. He wasn't expecting her to speak with such confidence. But the pause was brief, and his sneer returned quickly. "Suit yourself," he said, shrugging dramatically. "But don't say I didn't offer." The gang laughed again, but their leader's bravado seemed just a little less certain. Emily's calm response had thrown him off balance, even if he didn't want to admit it. As the laughter died down, Max let out a low, almost imperceptible growl. It wasn't loud enough for the bikers to hear, but Emily noticed it immediately. She reached down and gave him a reassuring pat on the head. "Not yet, Max," she whispered again. "Not yet." The tension in the air was thick now. The bikers were still smirking and making jokes, but Max's sharp gaze and Emily's steady calm had created an unspoken challenge. The gang didn't realize it, but they were playing a game they couldn't win. They thought they were in control, but they had no idea who they were dealing with or what Max was capable of. Jeff stepped back, chuckling as if he had won, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, doubt, maybe even unease. Max didn't take his eyes off him, his body still tense and ready. Emily stood quietly, her hand on Max's leash, waiting. She knew it wasn't time to act yet, but that moment was coming. And when it did, the bikers would realize their mistake. Max wasn't just a guide dog. He was so much more than they could ever imagine. The bikers' laughter echoed louder across the street, rough and sharp like nails on a chalkboard. Jeff, their leader, smirked as he took slow, deliberate steps toward Emily and Max. His boots scraped against the pavement, a sound that made Max's ears twitch. Jeff's cocky attitude filled the air like a bad smell, and the other bikers cheered him on from the sidelines. "What's the matter, huh?" Jeff taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe your dog's the one calling the shots around here." As if daring to prove his point, Jeff reached out his hand toward Max's leash. It was a bold move, but it wasn't a smart one. That was his first mistake. Before Jeff's hand could even come close, Max let out a deep, rumbling growl. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful, like distant thunder that warns of an oncoming storm. The sound stopped Jeff in his tracks. His smirk faltered, and he pulled his hand back quickly. "Whoa, easy there, Mutt," Jeff said, his voice suddenly less confident. He stepped back, chuckling nervously. "Didn't mean no harm." But the atmosphere had changed. The bikers' laughter grew quieter as they noticed the tension in Jeff's voice. Max stood perfectly still, his body tense and alert. His sharp eyes never left Jeff, watching his every move. Emily could feel the energy in Max, like a coiled spring ready to snap. She knew her dog well. Max wasn't just reacting out of instinct, he was calculating, waiting for the right moment. Emily broke the silence, her voice calm but firm. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said, tilting her head slightly in Jeff's direction. Her words were steady, her tone unwavering. "Max doesn't take kindly to strangers." Jeff laughed again, but this time the sound was forced. His bravado was slipping, though he didn't want to show it. He turned back to his gang, hoping for support, and they laughed with him, though not as loudly as before. "Oh yeah," Jeff said, turning to Emily again. "What's he gonna do, huh? Lick me to death?" Emily smiled faintly, tilting her head just enough to suggest she was sizing him up. "Something like that," she replied. Her voice was soft, almost playful, but there was something in her tone that made the bikers glance uneasily at each other. It was a tone that said she wasn't afraid, a tone that hinted there was more to her and her dog than met the eye. Jeff waved his hand dismissively, trying to shake off the growing unease. "Relax, lady. We're just having a little fun," he said, though his voice lacked the swagger it had moments before. He glanced at Max, who hadn't moved an inch. The dog's unblinking gaze was locked onto him, and it was unsettling. Jeff could feel the weight of those sharp eyes, and it made him shift his footing. "Man, it's just a dog," one of the bikers called out, trying to lighten the mood. "Don't let him scare you, Jeff." But Jeff didn't laugh this time. There was something about Max that didn't feel like just a dog. His growl wasn't like the usual barks or snarls you'd hear from a pet trying to protect its owner. It was controlled, deliberate, as if Max was holding back something far more dangerous. Emily stood quietly, her hand resting gently on Max's leash. She wasn't tense or flustered. She was calm, like someone who had been in situations like this before and knew exactly how to handle them. She felt Max's energy through the leash, strong, steady, and ready. She gave a small, reassuring tug, letting him know she was in control. Jeff took another step back, glancing nervously at his gang. He didn't like how this was playing out. He was supposed to be the one in charge, the one making others feel small. But now, standing in front of this blind woman and her dog, he felt like the tables were turning. And he didn't like it. "You're awfully brave for someone who can't even see me," Jeff said, his voice trying to sound tough but cracking slightly at the edges. Emily tilted her head again, her faint smile still in place. "I don't need to see you," she replied. "I can hear everything I need to know." Her words hung in the air, and Jeff's confidence wavered. He couldn't tell if she was bluffing or if she really could sense things he couldn't understand. Either way, it was unsettling. One of the bikers, a younger guy with a nervous laugh, tried to break the tension. "Hey, Jeff, maybe we should just leave her alone," he said, his voice barely audible over the city noise. "It's not worth it." Jeff shot him a glare. "Quiet," he snapped, but the crack in his authority was growing. His gang wasn't backing him up the way they usually did. They were shifting uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Emily, Max, and their leader. They could feel it too, this wasn't going the way Jeff had planned. Max let out another low growl, softer this time but no less powerful. Jeff froze again, his eyes darting to the dog. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out shaky. All right, he said, throwing up his hands in mock surrender. We'll leave you alone. No harm, no foul. Emily didn't move, her calm demeanor unshaken. That's a good idea, she said simply. Her voice wasn't threatening, but it carried a quiet authority that made Jeff take another step back. As the bikers started to back off, Jeff glanced at Max one last time. The dog hadn't budged, hadn't barked, but his presence was enough to make even someone like Jeff think twice. He turned to his gang, muttering something under his breath, and they all climbed back onto their motorcycles. The roar of engines filled the air again as the bikers sped off, leaving a trail of exhaust and uneasy silence behind them. Emily stood still, listening until the sound of the bikes faded into the distance. Max relaxed slightly, his body loosening as the tension drained away. Emily bent down and stroked his head, her voice soft and full of pride. Good job, Max, she whispered. Max looked up at her, his eyes bright and steady. He didn't need words to understand he had done exactly what he was trained to do. Emily straightened up, adjusted her grip on the leash, and began walking again. The world around her buzzed with life as if nothing had happened. But for those who had witnessed the scene, one thing was clear: Emily and Max were not to be underestimated. They were a team, a quiet, powerful force that no one saw coming. It happened so fast that the world seemed to hold its breath for a moment. A loud, sharp pop echoed across the street. It wasn't anything dangerous, just a car backfiring. But to Max, that sound was a signal. His instincts, honed by years of intense training, kicked in. In an instant, Max lunged forward. His bark was loud and commanding, a sound that seemed to cut through the air like a blade. It wasn't a frightened bark or a wild one, it was purposeful, full of authority. Max moved with precision, placing himself firmly between Emily and the bikers. His body was tense, his muscles coiled like a spring, ready to act if needed. The bikers froze in place, their laughter dying on their lips. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint rumble of the city around them and the low, steady growl coming from Max's throat. What the hell's wrong with your dog? Jeff finally blurted out. His voice wavered slightly, betraying his unease. He tried to sound tough, but the way he took a half step back told a different story. Emily's demeanor shifted. Gone was the quiet, unassuming woman who had been standing patiently on the corner. She straightened her back, standing tall and confident. Her face was calm but serious, and her voice, when she spoke, was steady and firm. Max isn't just any dog, she said, her tone carrying a weight that made everyone listen. He's a trained bomb squad canine. And right now, he doesn't like the way you're acting. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The bikers exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado fading. One of them, a younger man with a patch on his jacket that read Spike, frowned and muttered, "Bomb squad? You're kidding, right?" Emily turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "No," she replied simply. "I'm not." Jeff's sneer returned, though it wasn't as confident as before. "A bomb squad dog? What, he's gonna sniff us out for snacks or something?" He tried to laugh, but it sounded forced. Emily didn't flinch. She reached down, her hand resting lightly on Max's head. The dog stayed still, his gaze locked onto Jeff. His growl grew quieter but didn't stop. "Max is trained to detect danger," Emily said, her voice calm but firm. "And he's never wrong." Jeff's eyes darted from Emily to Max. The dog's steady, unblinking stare was unnerving. He could feel the intelligence behind those eyes, the sense that Max wasn't just an ordinary dog. He was something else entirely, something Jeff didn't fully understand, and that scared him. One of the bikers, an older man with a gray beard, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just back off, Jeff," he said, his voice low. "I mean, if the dog's trained like she says." "Shut up, Pete," Jeff snapped, but his voice lacked its usual edge. He was trying to keep control of the situation, but it was slipping through his fingers. Max took a single step forward, his growl deepening. Jeff flinched, his bravado crumbling even further. "Hey, we were just messing around, okay," he stammered, holding up his hands as if to prove he meant no harm. "No need to get the dog all worked up." Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression still calm but unyielding. "Messing around," she echoed. "You think mocking a blind woman and trying to grab her dog's leash is just messing around?" Jeff swallowed hard, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find a response. His gang wasn't laughing anymore. They stood behind him, silent and uneasy, glancing nervously at Max. Emily took a step forward, her voice steady and strong. "You don't know what Max is capable of, do you?" she asked. "Let me make it simple for you. He's trained to protect me. He's trained to respond to threats. And if you push him too far, you won't like what happens next." Jeff's face paled. He looked at Max again, and this time, he didn't see just a dog. He saw a force to be reckoned with, a living, breathing protector who wouldn't hesitate to act if he needed to. Okay, Jeff said quickly, his hands still raised. "We get it. No harm meant, all right? We'll back off." The tension in the air was almost tangible as the bikers slowly began to step back, their tough guy act completely shattered. Jeff, once so full of bravado, looked more like a scared kid than the leader of a gang. He glanced at Emily one last time, then turned to his bike. "Come on, let's get out of here," he muttered to his gang. The others didn't argue. They climbed onto their motorcycles, their earlier swagger replaced with quiet unease. As the roar of engines filled the air and the bikers sped away, Max's growl faded. He stood tall and steady, his body still tense but beginning to relax. Emily reached down and stroked his head, her touch gentle and reassuring. "Good boy, Max," she said softly. "You did exactly what you needed to." Max looked up at her, his tail giving a small wag. He didn't need words to understand her praise. He had done his job, and he had done it well. Emily turned back toward the street, the tension in her shoulders easing as she adjusted her grip on Max's leash. Around her, the city carried on as if nothing had happened. People passed by, oblivious to the scene that had just unfolded. But for Emily and Max, it was a moment that proved once again the strength of their bond. Max wasn't just her guide dog. He was her partner, her protector, and her constant reminder that strength doesn't always come in loud or flashy ways. Sometimes, strength is quiet and steady, waiting for the right moment to show itself. The bikers stumbled over themselves as they hurried to their motorcycles. Their tough act was gone, replaced with nervous glances and shaky hands. The once loud gang, who had roared into the scene like they owned the place, now looked like kids caught doing something they shouldn't. Jeff lingered for a moment, his hands clenched into fists. He glared at Emily, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed. He wasn't sure what to say, but he didn't want to leave without some parting shot. "You're lucky we're leaving," he muttered, his voice low and bitter. Emily didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hand resting on Max's leash. She smiled, not a big, triumphant grin, but a calm, knowing smile. "Lucky," she repeated, tilting her head slightly as if considering the word. "No, Jeff. Lucky is what happens when Max decides you're not a threat. Let's keep it that way." Her words landed like a weight in the air. Jeff's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't argue. With a grunt, he turned and swung his leg over his bike. The engine roared to life, and one by one, the gang followed him. Their motorcycles, once symbols of power and intimidation, now seemed like an escape route. As the bikers sped away, their laughter was gone, replaced by the fading growl of engines. Emily stood quietly, her hand gently stroking Max's head. She felt his body relax as the tension drained away. His sharp eyes followed the bikers until they disappeared into the distance. Only then did he let out a quiet huff, as if to say, "That's what I thought." Emily bent down, giving Max a soft pat on the head. "Good boy," she whispered. Max wagged his tail slowly, his job done. A moment later, a police officer stepped onto the scene. He had been standing at the corner, watching everything unfold from a distance. His uniform was crisp, and his hat